Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so today we're going to get into something pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah. What have we got?
We're looking at social history curation. And, maybe that sounds a bit dry.
A little dusty, maybe. Locked away in an archive somewhere.
Exactly. But trust us, the story we're unpacking today is actually, well, it's pretty explosive. It's controversial.
That's absolutely right. We're diving deep into a whole stack of sources, and they all center around one particular figure, a really formidable Scottish social historian named Dr. Elspeth King.
Right. And her whole mission really was about preserving the history of ordinary people.
Yeah, the working class, community voices, people often left out of the official story. And she had this incredible success with the People's Palace Museum in Glasgow. Made it one of the most loved museums in Europe, actually.
But that success came at a price, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. It ignited this huge cultural and political firestorm. We're talking about something that really shook up Glasgow's whole cultural scene for years.
And the scope of what we're covering today is, well, it's pretty wide. We've got notes here taking us from, political battles and accusations of cultural looting, all the way to some surprising artifacts. Billy Connolly's famous banana boots, for instance.
Ah, yes, the boots. Iconic.
And hidden stashes of stained glass. But we're also looking bigger picture at Scottish identity, medieval kings, these strange old paths called coffin roads.
Really fascinating, those.
And even how part of Scotland inspired Tintin, the Black Island.
It's amazing how these threads connect. So this is really a journey into a history that, well, it just refuses to be ignored or swept under the rug.
So for you listening, what's the core idea here? What's the main takeaway we're exploring?
I think the key thing to grasp is this tension, this kind of conceptual battlefield king setup. It's official history versus people's history.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, official history tends to be about governments, kings, queens, big battles, stuff found in formal documents, high art bought from fancy dealers,
The history books version,
Yeah.
sort of?
Pretty much. Whereas king championed people's history or social history. That means looking at the everyday stuff, the material culture of daily life, how people worked, what they did for fun, community identity, labor movements.
The texture of real life.
Exactly. And King's whole career is basically a case study in the surprising, sometimes really political lengths people have to go to save that heritage when the official channels just aren't interested, or maybe even actively hostile.
It's like history from the ground up, isn't it? Not top down.
Precisely.
Okay, let's start digging into this. Dr. King's background seems really important to understanding her approach. She wasn't exactly establishment, was she?
Not at all, and that's absolutely crucial. She came from Lochore in Fife. Her father was a coal miner, so she had this deep, first-hand understanding of working-class life.
But academically brilliant, too.
Oh, incredibly rigorous. She got a first-class honors degree from St. Andrews.
Wow.
In medieval history, no less, which, is serious stuff. Then she went on to do a postgrad in museum studies at Leicester.
So she had both the academic chops and this lived experience.
Exactly. That combination is the absolute key to her philosophy. It explains why she didn't just see the People's Palace as, like, a 9-to-5 job. It was a mission.
And the palace itself has an interesting history, right? On Glasgow Green.
Yeah, hugely significant location. Glasgow Green is, well, it's like the city's historic common land. Think Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, but maybe even more central to Glasgow's identity. A place for rallies, protests, public life for centuries.
And the museum was built for the people.
That was the intention. Opened way back in 1898, it was specifically meant as a museum and cultural center for the working class, especially in the East End of Glasgow.
But by the time King got there in 1974, things had changed.
Dramatically. The place was basically falling apart. Semi-derelict, badly neglected, starved of funds and resources. A real shame. She had a massive task ahead of her.
So this neglect plus the city was changing rapidly.
Yeah, huge demolition programs, redevelopment.
Yeah.
Whole areas disappearing. This pressure cooker situation basically forced King and her deputy Michael Donnelly, who later became her husband, into this really unconventional collecting strategy.
Okay, this is where the Middenraker nickname comes in.
That's it. Colleagues, probably the more traditional museum types, called them Middenrakers.
Kind of affectionately, maybe, but also a bit dismissive.
Midden being like an old Scots word for a rubbish heap.
Exactly. Because they were, quite literally, digging through what other people considered junk to find historical value. They had almost no money. A real shoestring budget, the sources call it.
So forget fancy auctions or dealers.
Absolutely forget it.
Yeah.
Their approach was hands-on, almost ethnographic. They were out there themselves, scavenging history before the bulldozers got to it.
Where were they looking?
The Barras Market was a key spot. That's this famous, sprawling Glasgow market full of bric-a-brac, secondhand stuff, antiques, just everything. They spent weekends scouring the stalls.
What kind of things were they picking up? Not Rembrandts, I assume. Definitely not. They were grabbing the everyday stuff, the ephemera that reflected ordinary life, things nobody else thought belonged in a museum.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, so the sources mention things like a life-size plaster bust of Elvis.
Elvis. In a Glasgow museum.
Yeah. Apparently it was a big seller in the markets in the late 70s. Reflects pop culture, cheap decor trends.
Huh.
Or like mass-produced Borzoi dog sculptures from the 1930s, those sleek Art Deco-ish things.
I think I know the ones.
And even, it was quite grim, a child's coffin from an old Masonic lodge dating back to the 1870s.
Oh, so really focusing on things that tell a social story, even if they're not valuable in the traditional sense.
Precisely. These weren't seen as antiques. They were just forgotten bits of social and consumer culture, abandoned things.
And how did this compare to, say, how other big collections were built, like the Burrell collection, which is also in Glasgow?
Oh, night and day. William Burrell, the shipping magnate, he had agents all over the world buying up medieval tapestries, Chinese porcelain, established masterpieces, using incredible wealth.
Right. Dealers and experts.
Exactly. King and Donnelly were doing the opposite. They were doing the dirty work themselves, sifting through the debris, rescuing what they called the intangible inheritance of the community.
Intangible inheritance. I like that. What does that really mean?
It's the memory embedded in objects, isn't it? The history of how people lived, popular culture, street life, changing tastes, social structures, all captured in things that other museums might have just walked past, things that were, as one source puts it, too fascinating to throw away, but which no other public place could use.
And it wasn't just market stalls, was it? They were actually saving parts of buildings.
Yes, and this was dangerous work. Glasgow was undergoing massive, quite brutal redevelopment in the 70s and 80s. Huge areas of old tenements, places like the Gorbals, Calton, Maryhill, were being flattened.
Whole communities disappearing.
Right. And King and Donnelly saw it as this desperate race against time. They were literally running ahead of the demolition crews, sometimes with chisel hammers, trying to salvage bits of the city's fabric before they ended up in landfill.
What kind of architectural bits are we talking about?
Amazing stuff, really. Ceramic tiles from closes, that's the passageways and tenements. Stunning stained glass windows. Donnelly became a real expert in Glasgow-made Victorian and Art Nouveau glass, built up a huge collection.
Stuff just being ripped out and smashed.
Often, yes. They also saved things like a complete tiled butcher's counter, elegant Art Nouveau finger plates from doors, even old metal tickets that showed the cubic footage of flats for sanitation laws. The real texture of Glasgow life.
You mentioned a coffin bath earlier. That sounds odd. What's the story there?
Ah, yes, the coffin bath. It came from a rather grand house in Blytheswood Square, which was a very wealthy part of the city.
Okay.
So this bath, long, narrow, probably designed to save hot water, represents the absolute peak of Victorian domestic plumbing and luxury for the elite.
Right, so displaying it wasn't just about the bath itself.
No, it was a teaching tool. A way to show the massive gulf between how the rich lived in Blytheswood Square and the conditions in the tenements, many of which had no indoor plumbing at all, maybe just a shared toilet out in the back court.
So it becomes a document of social inequality.
Exactly, and technological change, public health, all embodied in a bathtub. It tells you more, maybe, than pages of statistics could. It's a brilliant example of using material culture to tell a complex social story.
So this whole approach, the midden raking, the salvage work, unconventional as it was, it actually worked.
It worked spectacularly well. Despite having virtually no money, the People's Palace under King saw visitor numbers just explode. They went from about 80,000 a year to over 400,000.
That's a huge increase.
Massive. And it wasn't just popular success, it got major official recognition too. The museum won European Museum of the Year in 1981, and then British Museum of the Year in 1983. So this was undeniable proof that not only was social history valuable, it was incredibly popular, more popular, in fact, than many collections full of high art. People wanted to see their own history reflected. But, that very success, built on this radical approach, that's where the trouble really started brewing.
How so?
Because King's whole curatorial philosophy was about pushing boundaries, deliberately challenging what traditional museums thought was, proper history or acceptable art. She wasn't afraid to stir things up if it meant showing the real, sometimes messy, life of Glasgow.
Okay, let's get into the specific controversies. The first big one you mentioned, Billy Connolly's banana boots.
Ah, the boots, yes. Designed by the pop artist Edmund Smith in 1975, these huge, bright yellow banana-shaped boots became iconic for Connolly, who was arguably Glasgow's biggest star at the time.
Putting them in a museum, though, that caused problems.
Immediate backlash. Intense. Letters flooded into the council, the newspapers.
What were people complaining about? Just silly boots in a serious museum.
It went much deeper than that. The sources make it clear the outrage was moral, political. People weren't just upset about footwear. They were furious that the museum was validating Billy Connolly himself.
Because of his comedy.
Exactly. His routines were seen as potty-mouthed, irreverent, even blasphemous by some. There was particular anger about a famous routine he did in 1974, the crucifixion routine, set in a Glasgow pub called the Saracen Head.
Right, that caused huge protests at the time, didn't it? Accusations of blasphemy.
It did. So for the museum to then display his boots, critics saw it as the council endorsing this figure they found offensive. The letters claimed the museum was bringing Glasgow into disrepute.
Was there maybe an element of King knowing this would be provocative, using the controversy to get attention for the museum? A bit of curatorial marketing?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's hard to separate entirely. King definitely understood that a museum for the people needed to engage with popular culture, with what people were actually talking about, not just, Victorian lace doilies.
Even if it was controversial pop culture.
Especially if it was controversial. Connolly was the voice of modern Glasgow for many people, whether the establishment liked his language or not. Displaying the boots was a statement, this is part of our culture too. Comedy, working-class heroes, popular entertainment, this matters. It was a direct challenge to the idea that museums should only deal in safe, highbrow subjects.
Okay, that makes sense. It sets the stage for the next big clash then, displaying art made by prisoners.
Yes, controversy too. Reinterpreting art and crime. King exhibited work from the special unit at Barlinnie Prison. This was a controversial unit led by the former gangster Jimmy Boyle, who had become a sculptor and writer in prison.
So art by convicted criminals, including Boyle himself, a convicted murderer. That must have been even more controversial than the boots.
Profoundly controversial.
Yeah.
Hugely transgressive for a public museum at that time. She was effectively giving a platform to people society had, locked away and preferred to forget.
What kind of art was it?
The exhibition included a huge mural painted inside the prison unit, and also these incredibly detailed little models made from matchsticks.
Matchsticks?
Yeah, apparently the prisoners made them in secret, often, because the sources say prison officers would routinely destroy them if they found them, seen as a waste of time, or maybe even a security risk. Who knows?
So displaying these was quite pointed.
Absolutely. And the Hold Special Unit project was already under fire from parts of the press and public. They saw it as a cushy number for killers, treating serious offenders too softly.
But King saw value in it.
She did. She framed the exhibition as a success story, demonstrating human potential. Her view was that it showed the creativity that can emerge when people, even prisoners, are treated with some dignity, not just like animals.
So it was a statement about rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Human spirit.
Yes, and it brought the reality of the prison system and the debates around it right into the public space of the museum. Forced uncomfortable conversation. King noted years later she was still getting bad reactions to that exhibition, which shows how deep the feelings ran.
Okay, and the third controversy involved contemporary art and, surprisingly, job creation schemes.
Right. Controversy 3. Contemporary artists and jobs creation. This shows King being incredibly resourceful, actually. She managed to use government jobs creation funds, temporary employment schemes, to commission proper artists.
Who did she commission?
Most notably, Alistair Gray, who later became a giant of Scottish literature and art. She got her to paint portraits of significant Glasgow figures, people like Jimmy Reid, the famous trade union leader, and Argo MacDonald, the nationalist politician.
That's clever, using job funds to build the museum's collection with contemporary portraits.
Very clever, but she had to be a bit creative to get it approved. The fine art bosses in the museum hierarchy were apparently skeptical, so King told them Gray was just being hired to, quote, record collections. like technical drawing or something.
A bit of bureaucratic maneuvering.
Exactly. But the real aim was capturing the faces of contemporary Glasgow, the people shaping its political and social landscape in the 70s and 80s.
And there's a great story about Alasdair Gray leaving.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Gray eventually left the portrait project, and King, in her own words, was really cut up about it at the time. She needed the work done.
Understandable.
But she didn't realize why he was leaving. He left to finish writing his masterpiece novel, Lanark. King later said she had no idea at the time she was witnessing the departure of potentially the greatest Scottish novelist since Sir Walter Scott. A fantastic bit of historical irony.
So we've got this picture. Massive popular success, major awards, but built on pushing boundaries, courting controversy, and some clever maneuvering. It sounds like a collision was inevitable.
It really does. And it came to a head in 1990. This became known as the Storm in the Palace.
What happened?
Despite her 16 years of award-winning leadership, King was passed over for promotion. A new, more senior post was created, Keeper Social History, and she didn't get it. Someone else was appointed over her head.
After winning European Museum of the Year, that seems odd.
It seemed outrageous to many people. The general consensus among critics and supporters was that creating this new post was just a deliberate, cynical ruse to finally wrest control of the People's Palace away from King.
Why would they want to do that?
The sources suggest a potent mix of factors. Critics argued she was being victimized. For being working class, for being a woman in a male-dominated museum world, for being too clever, too successful, and fundamentally for being a Scot who refused to just, toe the establishment line. She wasn't playing their game.
And her deputy, Michael Donnelly?
He was subsequently sacked. The official reason given was for bringing Glasgow into disrepute, likely related to speaking out during the controversy. It looked very much like a purge.
How did the public react?
Massively. Became a huge public scandal. The Glasgow Herald newspaper apparently received the biggest volume of letters on the subject since Billy Graham, the American evangelist, visited in the 1950s.
That's incredible public interest.
It's huge. A grassroots campaign collected 10,000 signatures demanding her reinstatement. And 63 really prominent figures, artists like Alasdair Gray, poets like Edwin Morgan, even Billy Connolly again wrote this powerful open letter supporting her. It blew up into a major row about cultural values, class, and control.
Did anyone involved in the decision ever admit it was about her gender or class?
Well, there's a notorious alleged comment attributed to Julian Spalding, who was the director of Glasgow Museums at the time, and chaired the committee that rejected King. He supposedly said something like, there were no jobs for the girls.
Wow. In 1990?
Yeah. Spalding denied it or contextualized it differently later, I believe, but it was widely reported at the time and certainly fueled the perception of sexism. Writers like James Kelman framed it as part of a bigger picture, the city council sidelining anyone with old-fashioned principles who didn't fit their new agenda.
So what was the council's agenda? How did they respond to this huge outcry? People like Patrick Lally, who was a powerful figure in the Labour Council.
Their response was basically dismissal. They brushed off the thousands of signatories, the famous artists and writers, labeling them dilettanti, well-heeled authors, and professional wingers. Just out-of-touch elites, basically.
But why? What was driving their decisions?
This is where you have to understand the context of 1990. Glasgow was designated European City of Culture that year, and the council leadership saw this primarily as an economic opportunity.
Okay.
Patrick Lally himself said it very bluntly. The goal was to use the title to the maximum advantage. We are going to milk it for all it is worth.
Milk it for all it's worth. That's pretty stark language about culture.
It is. It reveals a shift towards running the city and its culture like a business. Culture becomes a tool for attracting investment, tourism, rebranding the city on an international stage.
And King's kind of history didn't fit that brand.
Apparently not. A museum focusing on Glasgow's working-class struggles, strikes, socialism, radical history. That wasn't the image they wanted to project to international investors. It was seen as, perhaps, a liability in this new culture of capital. King's defiantly local, often gritty social history didn't align with the glossy, commercialized vision.
So the history she saved was potentially embarrassing to the new image.
That seems to be the implication, yes. It was disposable when it conflicted with the marketing strategy.
And after King was effectively pushed out, what happened to the People's Palace and her collections?
Well, according to King herself, and she's been very vocal about this for years, the museum was essentially stripped bare. She uses terms like cultural looting.
Strong words. What does she mean?
She argues that key collections she and Donnelly had built up were deliberately dispersed, hidden away, or moved elsewhere, effectively dismantling her legacy and undermining the museum's focus.
Can you give examples?
The big one is the stained glass collection Donnelly amassed. King claims it hasn't been seen by the public for 30 years, just languishing in storage somewhere.
That amazing collection of Glasgow glass, just gone.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
Other things, like unique salvaged interiors, they save whole sections of places like the Rendezvous Cafe and the Kelton Bar. These were moved out of the People's Palace to the newer Riverside Museum, the Transport Museum.
Okay, was there an official reason given for moving things, like better conservation or display elsewhere?
The official line is usually about rationalizing collections, creating better thematic displays in the new, purpose-built museums like Riverside, making things world-class.
But King disagrees with that rationale.
Strongly. She argues that taking artifacts that represent a specific community's history out of that community's museum, the People's Palace, was fundamentally the Museum of the East End, and putting them in a different context, like decorating a recreated pawn shop in a transport museum.
Well, she calls it identity theft on a city scale.
Because the context is lost. Exactly. The deep social history connection gets diluted or lost altogether. She argues it diminishes the understanding of working-class Glasgow history, and by extension, Scottish history overall. And the fact that a whole section she curated on medieval Glasgow was also removed just reinforces her view that it was about erasing her specific historical interpretation.
So after leaving the People's Palace under such, well, difficult circumstances, King didn't just disappear, did she?
Oh, absolutely not. If anything, the sources suggest it fueled her determination. Her subsequent work, often more academic but still fiercely public-facing, really feels like a continuation of that battle, a kind of intellectual revenge, perhaps, against the forces that tried to sideline her vision of history.
And a key part of that vision was challenging conventional history writing. You mentioned document-focused myopia.
Yes, that's the phrase she uses. It's a critique of historians who rely only on official written records, government papers, church documents, aristocratic letters, that sort of thing.
Why is that a problem? Isn't that what history is based on?
It's part of history. But King's argument is that if that's all you look at, you automatically miss out huge chunks of the human story. You miss the illiterate, who left no written records. You miss the working classes, whose lives weren't usually documented by the state unless they caused trouble.
Yeah.
You miss dissenters, rebels.
And women, presumably.
Especially women. For centuries, women's lives, experiences, and knowledge were primarily recorded and transmitted through oral tradition, through material culture, think textiles, recipes, domestic objects, through poetry, songs, letters maybe, but rarely in the official archives of power. So, document-focused myopia creates a history that's overwhelmingly male, elite, and establishment biased.
Right, it's a very narrow lens.
Very. And King used her own expertise, particularly her background in medieval history, to actively reclaim narratives that this narrow lens had missed or distorted.
Let's look at her work on medieval Glasgow. She insisted it was important long before the tobacco lords.
Absolutely. She pushed back hard against the idea that Glasgow's history only really starts in the 18th century with the rise of trade and industry. She wanted to show its foundational role much earlier.
How so?
Her key focus was on the Wars of Independence in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Specifically, the role of Bishop Robert Wishart of Glasgow.
Okay, not a name many people might know. Why was he so important?
Wishart was a major political player and a staunch supporter of Scottish independence against Edward I of England. He was incredibly defiant. But perhaps his most crucial act came in 1306.
What did he do?
Robert the Bruce had just killed his main rival for the Scottish throne, John Comyn, in a church in Dumfries. This was a sacrilegious act, a massive political and religious problem for Bruce.
Right, murder in a sacred place.
Exactly. But Bishop Wishart, defying the Pope and the English king, formally absolved Bruce of this sin. This act was absolutely essential. It gave Bruce the religious and political legitimacy he needed to rally support and eventually become King Robert I.
So Wishart's actions were pivotal for Scotland's future.
King argued, very forcefully, that they were. Her claim, which is pretty bold, was, without Glasgow and Bishop Wishart, Scotland would not be independent. She saw Glasgow as central to the nation's very survival.
And that historical narrative was removed from the People's Palace after she left.
That's what she maintains. The removal of that specific section, highlighting Glasgow's crucial medieval role, looked, to her and her supporters, like a deliberate attempt to downplay that interpretation and erase her contribution. It underscored the idea that deciding what history gets told is inherently political.
Okay, moving from powerful bishops to forgotten voices. You mentioned she rediscovered Scotland's first woman in print.
Yes, this is a fantastic story of historical recovery. Elizabeth Melville, who became Lady Culross, she lived from about 1578 to 1640.
And she was published back then.
She was. Her major work, a long religious poem called An Godly Dream, was first published in Edinburgh in 1603. And it wasn't just a one-off, it was incredibly popular. It went through at least 13 editions over the next century or so.
What was the poem about? Was it just devotional?
It was deeply religious, yes, but it also had a sharp political edge. Melville was part of the Presbyterian faction that strongly opposed King James VI's attempts to impose more episcopal control over the Scottish church. She actually wrote, in part, for ministers who had been imprisoned for their opposition to the king's policies.
So the poem was an act of defiance.
You could definitely read it that way. It contains lines that seem directly aimed at political and religious oppression. There's a quote the sources highlight. "Though tyrants threat, though lions rage and roar, defy them all and fear not to win out."
Wow. Defy them all. That's strong stuff for a woman writing under King James VI, who wasn't exactly known for tolerating dissent.
It's incredibly powerful language for that time and context. Yet, despite her contemporary fame and the poem's clear significance, Melville was largely forgotten by mainstream history and literary studies for centuries, written out.
Until people like King started digging her up again.
Exactly. King championed her importance. And it took until 2014, quite recently, for Melville's name to finally be added to the Macar's Court, the flagstones outside the Writers' Museum in Edinburgh that celebrates Scottish authors. A long overdue recognition.
It shows how easily even published figures can be lost if they don't fit the dominant narrative.
Precisely. Now, another area where King was arguably way ahead of her time was in confronting Scotland's, and specifically Glasgow's, role in the transatlantic slave trade.
This is what we now call difficult heritage. Was she tackling this back in the 70s and 80s?
She was. Long before it became a major focus for museums globally, King was using the People's Palace collection to highlight this uncomfortable history, the source of so much of the city's 18th century wealth.
How does she do that? What does she display?
She used really direct, tangible evidence. For instance, exhibiting old Glasgow newspaper advertisements from the 1700s. Ads offering rewards for the capture and return of runaway enslaved people who had been brought to Scotland.
That brings it home very directly, doesn't it?
Absolutely. No ambiguity there. She was also instrumental in drawing attention to a specific portrait, a grand painting of John Glassford, one of Glasgow's wealthiest tobacco lords, with his family.
Okay.
For years, the painting was quite dark and dirty. King exhibited it, making the connection between Glassford's wealth and slavery clear in the interpretation. But when the painting was finally cleaned properly, much later in 2007, it clearly revealed the figure of an enslaved black child servant standing beside the family.
Wow. Hidden in plain sight, almost.
Exactly. Confirming visually what King had been arguing contextually for years, the direct link between the tobacco lord's fortunes and the exploitation of enslaved Africans.
Did she display other objects related to slavery?
Yes, the sources mention a particularly chilling object, a silver slave collar, believed to have been worn by an enslaved person in Scotland. Displaying something like that forces a confrontation with the brutal reality that underlies the grand Georgian architecture of the merchant city.
It challenges that comfortable narrative of Glasgow just being the second city of the empire built on ingenuity and hard work.
Completely. It insists on acknowledging the exploitation. And King's critique wasn't just historical. She applied it to the present-day landscape, too.
You mentioned the Dalton Fountain on Glasgow Green.
Yes, this huge, ornate terracotta fountain, erected in 1887 for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. It's very prominent right there on the green.
And her issue with it is
that it stands largely uninterpreted as a seemingly straightforward celebration of Queen Victoria and the British Empire. It's covered in figures of soldiers from imperial regiments around the world. King argues it effectively extols the empire, the fruits of slavery, without any critical context provided.
just a monument to imperial glory.
Pretty much. And she recalls the famous old Glasgow socialist Harry McShane, one of the original Red Clydesiders, being absolutely furious about this fountain being placed on Glasgow Green, the people's common land. McShane apparently said it was the only piece of architecture in Glasgow he'd happily take dynamite to.
That's quite a statement. It shows the deep ideological clash over how the empire should be remembered, right there on the green.
Absolutely. The fountain represents one view. McShane's anger represents the radical counter-history that King felt the People's Palace should be championing.
And finally, just briefly, King also made sure to cover specific social movements in her exhibitions.
Yes, she didn't just collect objects, she actively curated exhibitions on important social change movements. Two examples stand out in the sources.
Okay.
First, the temperance movement. In 1979, she curated Scotland, sober and free for the movement's 150th anniversary. Glasgow was a huge center for temperance, sometimes called the birthplace of teetotalism. It was a massive social force.
Right, tackling the impact of alcohol.
Exactly. And second, women's suffrage. In 1978, she compiled a pamphlet marking 50 years since the 1918 Act that first gave some women the vote, those over 30 with property.
So highlighting these grassroots movements for social change.
Yes, ensuring that the history of activism, temperance, suffrage things driven by ordinary people was given space and recognition alongside the history of industry or wealth. It was all part of that people's history philosophy.
Okay, so we've seen how Dr. King fought to reclaim history from objects, archives, even controversial art. But the sources also show her interest extended beyond museum walls, right? Into the actual physical landscape of Scotland.
Yes, absolutely. Just like she rescued artifacts people were throwing away, she was also interested in rescuing the stories embedded in overlooked bits of infrastructure, in the very geography of the country, things like old roads, canals, islands.
Let's start with those coffin roads you mentioned earlier. The Stony Mullen Coffin Road. That name alone is incredibly evocative. What exactly were they?
They sound quite macabre, don't they? They were essentially pathways, often quite ancient and informal, used specifically for carrying the dead to burial.
Why did they need special roads for that?
It comes down to medieval church organization. Only certain main parish churches had the right to bury people. If you lived in a remote settlement, miles away from the nearest consecrated ground, you had no choice but to physically carry your deceased loved one, sometimes for very long distances across difficult terrain.
So these roads were literally lifelines, or death lines, I suppose, connecting communities to their final resting place.
Exactly. The Stony Mullen Road, mentioned in the sources, is a specific example. It runs between Balloch, down by Loch Lomond, and the old burial ground at St. Matthew's Chapel near Cardross. It's actually now part of modern long-distance paths, like the Three Lochs Way and the John Muir Way.
And carrying a coffin for miles. That must have been incredibly difficult.
Immensely hard physical labor. But it was also deeply imbued with ritual and superstition. These weren't just practical routes. They were pathways shaped by folklore and fear of the dead.
Okay, tell us about the superstitions. They sound fascinatingly eerie.
Well, the sources list quite a few rules governing these journeys. One major one was that the coffin must never touch the ground during the journey.
Never. Why not?
The belief was that if it rested on the earth, the spirit of the deceased would be able to return and haunt the living from that spot. Imagine the pressure on the pallbearers, carrying a heavy coffin over rough ground, unable to set it down for a rest.
That's intense. What else?
The corpse had to be carried feet first, pointing away from their home to prevent the spirit finding its way back.
Okay.
And the bearers had to be incredibly careful not to stray off the designated path onto adjacent farmland.
Why is that?
Fear of spiritual contamination. They believed the spirit's passage would blight the crops, ruin the harvest, a terrifying prospect for farming communities.
So the path itself was almost like a spiritually quarantined zone?
In a way, yes. And the paths themselves often weren't straight. They deliberately meandered.
To make the journey longer, that seems counterintuitive.
The idea was that spirits were believed to travel in straight lines. So a winding path would supposedly confuse or lose any spirit trying to follow the cortege back home.
Clever in a spooky way.
And crucially, these paths were often routed specifically to cross-running water streams, or burns as they're called in Scotland.
Why?
Because of the very widespread ancient belief that spirits, ghosts, and other supernatural entities cannot cross running water. It acted as a spiritual barrier. Crossroads were also favored points on the route, again, thought to confuse pursuing spirits.
Wow. It's a whole hidden layer of belief mapped onto the landscape.
Exactly. The existence of these roads tells you so much about medieval and early modern folk beliefs, the relationship with death, the power of superstition alongside official religion, and the sheer physical challenges of life in rural Scotland. It's history written on the ground itself.
Okay, moving from these ancient winding footpaths to something much more engineered. Let's talk about military engineering and ancient walls. How did Scotland's road network develop later on?
Well, the big leaps forward were driven by two main forces, war and commerce. In the 18th century, after the Jacobite rebellions, the British government realized they needed better roads in the Highlands to move troops quickly and control the region.
This is General Wade's roads.
That's right. General Wade built hundreds of miles of military roads and bridges. Then later, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, you get engineers like Thomas Telford, often called the finest civil engineer of his time.
And his focus was different.
More towards commerce and industry. Telford improved roads, built canals, harbors, connecting the burgeoning industrial centers, facilitating trade. It's a shift from military control to economic development, reflected in the infrastructure.
And Bowling Basin is mentioned as a key location where these histories intersect.
Yes, Bowling Basin on the River Clyde, just west of Glasgow. It's significant primarily as the western entrance to the Forth and Clyde Canal.
Okay, the canal linking the two coasts.
Exactly. Opened in 1790, a massive feat of engineering for its time. It cut right across Scotland's narrow central belt, connecting the River Forth near Edinburgh with the Clyde, allowing ships to avoid the long, dangerous sea journey around the north coast. Hugely important for industry and trade.
But Bowling's history goes back way further than the canal, doesn't it? To Roman times.
It does. Bowling is very near the village of Old Kilpatrick, which historians generally agree marked the western end of the Antonine Wall.
Rome's final frontier in Britain.
Pretty much. Built starting around 142 AD under Emperor Antoninus Pius. It wasn't stone like Hadrian's Wall further south. It was mainly a turf rampart built on a stone base, stretching about 39 miles from the Firth of Forth to the Clyde.
And it had forts along it.
Yes, 16 main forts, plus smaller fortlets, all linked by a road called the Military Way. It was a serious statement of Roman power.
But it didn't last long.
That's the crucial part. Despite the immense effort involved in building it, the Romans abandoned the Antonine Wall less than a decade after they finished it. They just couldn't hold it.
Why not?
Constant pressure and resistance from the local tribes, the Caledonians as the Romans called them. It proved too difficult, too costly, too dangerous to maintain that northern line. They retreated back south to Hadrian's Wall.
So Bowling Basin isn't just the start of an 18th century canal. It's also pretty much the high water mark of the Roman Empire in Britain.
Exactly. It's a place where these grand imperial ambitions, both Roman and later British industrial, literally met the realities of Scottish geography and resistance. Layers of history right there.
Okay, let's shift focus again out to the Islers. Loch Lomond and the West Coast. There seems to be something about Scottish islands that really fires the imagination.
Definitely. Even the freshwater islands of Loch Lomond have their share of history and legend. Loch Lomond has, 22 named islands? Maybe more, depending on how you count.
And Inchmurrin is the biggest.
Yes, Inchmurrin is the largest freshwater island in the whole of Britain. And it's got history. It has the ruins of Lennox Castle, dating back to the 14th century.
Who lived there?
It was mainly used as a hunting lodge by the powerful Earls of Lennox. Apparently, they retreated there during a plague outbreak in Balloch at one point. Gives you a sense of its isolation.
Any famous connections?
Well, it has a connection to Rob Roy MacGregor, the famous outlaw. During his feud with the Duke of Montrose in the early 1700s, Rob Roy and his men raided Inchmurrin, which was then held by Montrose's supporters. So these islands weren't just peaceful retreats. They were caught up in Scotland's turbulent clan history, too.
Okay, now for maybe the most surprising connection in our sources, Tintin. How on earth does Tintin connect to Scottish geography?
It's a great story. It relates to one of the most famous Tintin adventures, the Black Island.
Right, with the scary gorilla, Renko.
That's the one. The original version was set in England, but when Hergé, Tintin's creator, was asked to update the artwork for British publication in the 1960s, he wanted this setting to feel more authentically remote and mysterious.
So he looked to Scotland.
Exactly. He sent his main assistant, Bob Damore, on a research trip to Scotland to gather visual inspiration.
And Damore found what he was looking for.
Oh, absolutely. The sources say he was captivated by the rugged landscapes, the isolated castles, the whole atmosphere of the West Coast and the islands. And his findings directly shaped the look and feel of the revised and now classic version of the Black Island.
Can you point to specific places that inspired the artwork?
Yes. For the little Scottish village where Tintin first arrives, called Kiltalk in the book, Damore used Castle Bay on the Isle of Barra as his model.
Barra, way out in the Outer Hebrides.
That's right. Its harbor, the look of the village, that feeling of remoteness that became Kiltalk.
And the Black Island itself, with the ruined castle where the villains and the gorilla hide out.
That was inspired by Lacranza Castle, a ruin on the Isle of Arran in the Firth of Clyde. Its dramatic location right by the water, its ruined state, that became the look for Craigdui Castle on the Black Island. Dumore perfectly captured that slightly menacing, ancient, isolated feel.
And there was another specific Barra feature used.
Yes, the absolutely unique beach landing strip at Barra Airport. It's the only airport in the world with scheduled flights landing on a tidal beach.
I've seen pictures of that. It's amazing.
Dumore saw it, and it became the model for the villain's secret airstrip on the Black Island, where they land their plane to escape.
That's brilliant. Using a real, unique piece of modern Scottish infrastructure in the middle of this Gothic adventure.
It really is. It shows how perfectly the Scottish landscape, with its mix of ancient ruins and modern quirks, could feed into this adventure story. The whole plot, actually, feels a bit like those classic Scottish thrillers, like John Buchan's The 39 Steps. The hero on the run, wrongly accused, heading into the wild landscape.
So the geography itself tells a story that resonates globally.
Exactly. And that idea that the landscape, the overlooked roads, the forgotten histories, the popular culture, all hold vital parts of the national story. That's exactly what Elspeth King dedicated her career to fighting for. #tag outro. So if we try and pull all these threads together, the midden raking, the controversial exhibits, the medieval bishops, the coffin roads, even Tintin, what's the bigger picture that emerges from Dr. King's work and the controversies around it?
It really feels like a constant battle, doesn't it? A fight for the integrity of history itself.
I think that's exactly right. Whether it's saving a plaster Elvis from a market stall or insisting on the importance of an ancient pathway defined by folklore, it's all part of the same struggle. Challenging the narrow, often elitist definition of what counts as history.
And challenging who gets to decide what's important.
Precisely. She constantly pushed back against that document-focused myopia we talked about. Her argument was, if academics and official institutions ignore material culture, oral history, popular memory, then you leave the field wide open for, Hollywood or the commercial heritage industry to create the narrative.
And those narratives often strip out the difficult bits, the politics, the struggle.
Often, yes. They can become simplified, romanticized, depoliticized. King saw her work as resisting that simplification.
She actually curated an exhibition about William Wallace, didn't she, after the Braveheart movie came out?
She did, at the Stirling Smith Art Gallery and Museum after she left Glasgow. And it's a great example of her philosophy in action. She knew the movie was full of inaccuracies, but she saw it as a huge opportunity.
How so?
She called the film a valuable catalyst. It made people hugely interested in Wallace, Scotland's biggest international icon. So her exhibition aimed to provide the real history, but she did it in her characteristic way.
Using everyday objects.
Exactly. Alongside historical artifacts, she sourced things like 19th century grandfather clocks, umbrella stands, ornaments, banners, all featuring Wallace's image. Things loaned not by big institutions, but by ordinary families, collectors, people who had treasured this popular memory of Wallace for generations. It connected the historical figure to his enduring presence in Scottish popular culture.
And it worked. People came.
Hugely. Apparently 30,000 visitors came to that exhibition, wanting to learn the real story behind the movie icon. It showed you could engage a massive audience with serious history if you connected it to their culture.
So what's the takeaway for us, for you listening, from King's story and struggles? Why does it still matter now?
I think King's own quote, "History is when it happens," is key. History isn't just something dead and buried in the past. It's an active process, constantly being interpreted, debated, fought over right now.
We have to stay vigilant.
Absolutely. The sources really underline the need to be constantly critical of the information we receive, to watch out for fake news and spin, as one source puts it, and to always ask, where does this story come from? What's the evidence? Whose voice is being prioritized and whose is being ignored?
Whether it's a museum display or a news report.
Exactly. It requires active engagement. Look at Estonia, for example. After decades, centuries really, of foreign domination, including the Soviet era, they recently built their new national museum. And where did they build it?
Where?
On the site of a former Soviet airbase. A deliberate physical act of reclaiming their history, preserving their memory on the very ground, symbolizing past oppression. It's a powerful statement about the importance of actively curating and defending your past.
So it's about making a claim on memory, whether that's building a museum or saving stained glass from a skip. We need to be active curators of our own understanding.
Beautifully put. And perhaps, as a final thought to leave you with, something that captures that unexpected, ingenious spirit of Scottish history that King championed.
Okay.
Consider this. Back in the 18th century, scientists managed to calculate the weight of the entire planet Earth.
The whole planet.
Using basically just three things. the Scottish mountain Schiehallion, the stars, and a pendulum.
You're kidding. How does that work?
They use the immense, predictable gravitational pull of the mountain Schiehallion to measure how much it deflected a pendulum's plumb line from the true vertical, determined by the stars. By calculating the mountain's density and volume and seeing how much its mass affected the pendulum, they could extrapolate the density of the Earth itself, and from that, its total weight or mass.
That's incredible, measuring the whole world using one Scottish mountain.
Isn't it just? That incredible scale of discovery, that ability to use the local landscape to unlock universal secrets. That's the kind of inventive, surprising, and profound heritage that people like Elspeth King fought so hard to make sure we continue to explore, understand, and value. It's a legacy worth fighting for.